The early 1990s. The dust of the Cold War had just settled, and the world was stepping into a new era. That night, Washington was silent until a drunken president appeared in front of the White House. A man, holding a bottle of Baltica beer, staggering toward the security checkpoint. It was Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin. You won't find a single line about this incident in the official records. But the American agents who witnessed that night still say the same thing. If the cameras had been rolling, history would have been written very differently. In this video, we lift the curtain on that mysterious night and get closer to the truth behind the hidden scandal. But before we tell this story, I have a small request from you. If you're curious about such hidden historical events and the unknown faces of world leaders, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Because the story I'm going to tell today is not just a drunken anecdote. This is the real story of how the fragile balance between two superpowers could be endangered in a single night. And believe me, this is just the beginning. It was past midnight, September 1994. The Secret Service agents guarding the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance of the White House were going about their routine. That year, under the presidency of Bill Clinton, America was trying to build a new relationship with the post-Soviet world. The Russian Federation was struggling to rise from the massive wreckage of the Soviet Union, and the whole world was holding its breath to see how this transition would unfold. At Blair House, one of Washington's diplomatic guest residences, Russian President Boris Yeltsin was staying for an official visit. Everyone was asleep, everyone was resting, or at least that's how it was supposed to be. But that night, something was wrong in Yeltsin's room. Maybe it was the weight of time pressing down on him. Maybe it was the loneliness of leading a nation born from the ashes of the Soviet Empire. Or maybe it was simply the alcohol. Yeltsin was a man who knew how deeply vodka and drinking habits were rooted in Russian political culture. But that night, there was a restlessness within him, a kind of unease. He got out of bed, threw on something over his pajamas. The corridor was empty. Security kept a respectful distance not to disturb him. Yeltsin quietly walked outside, out the door of Blair House, into the cold Washington night. And then came that moment. A staggering figure holding a bottle of alcohol approached the White House security post. Agents immediately went on alert. Who was this man? What was he doing here? Weapons were raised. Radios crackled. But then, as the man's face came into the light, everyone froze. This man was the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, drunk, barefoot, and standing at the gates of the White House, trying to order pizza. Yes, you heard that right. The leader of the world's second most powerful nuclear force was, in the middle of the night, drunkenly wandering in front of the official residence of the President of the United States, looking for pizza. The agents glanced at each other in panic. What were they supposed to do? What was the protocol? Could they detain a foreign head of state? Or should they just politely send him back? But Yeltsin, seemingly unaware of the chaos he had caused, turned to one of the agents and muttered in a mix of English and Russian, "Pizza. American pizza. I want." The situation was so absurd that the agents struggled not to laugh. But this was no time for laughter. This was an international incident. And if the press found out, the scandal would explode globally. The Secret Service quickly took action. They gently grabbed Yeltsin by the arm and escorted him back to Blair House. Meanwhile, senior officials at the White House were awakened. A crisis team was assembled. Bill Clinton's national security advisor was alerted. Everyone was asking the same question. How could this happen? Where was Russia's security team? How had things reached this point? But the answers hadn't yet come. Because Yeltsin had approached the White House security checkpoints drunk, not just once, but several times. And each time, the same question was asked again. How is this man running Russia? But to understand the background of this story, we need to know who Boris Yeltsin was, where he came from, and what was happening in Russia at the time. Because what happened that night in front of the White House wasn't just a drunken incident. It was a reflection of the collapse of an empire, the loneliness of a leader, and the darkest corners of global politics. Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin was born in 1931 in the Sverdlovsk region, in what is now Ekaterinburg. He grew up within the Soviet system, studied engineering, and rose through the ranks of the Communist Party. In the late 1980s, with Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, he entered the political scene. But he never got along with Gorbachev. Yeltsin wanted more radical changes. In 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he became the first elected president of the Russian Federation. From that moment on, he carried one of the heaviest burdens in history, rebuilding post-Soviet Russia. But this rebuilding process was anything but easy. The economy had collapsed. Inflation was skyrocketing. The people were hungry and angry. Oligarchs were plundering state assets. War had broken out in Chechnya. And in the middle of all this chaos, Yeltsin increasingly turned to alcohol. According to Kremlin insiders, Yeltsin's drinking problem became severe by the mid-1990s. Reports surfaced of him arriving drunk to meetings, disappearing suddenly at international summits, and being unable to finish speeches. But the Russian state media covered it all up. Because in the eyes of the West, Yeltsin was Russia's hope for democracy. If his condition were exposed, the entire transition process could be jeopardized. And this is where that night in Washington comes into play. Because American officials never forgot that night, but they also never exposed it. Why? Because cold calculations were at work. America wanted good relations with Russia. NATO expansion was on the agenda. Nuclear weapons control was critical. And if Yeltsin's scandal came to light, nationalist and communist opposition in Moscow would grow stronger. Yeltsin might even fall. And who would replace him? Perhaps someone tougher, more unpredictable. America couldn't take that risk. That's why what happened that night remained a secret known only to a few people for years. But the story doesn't end there. Because Yeltsin's drunken episodes didn't happen only in Washington. In 1995, at Shannon Airport, he was scheduled to meet the Irish Prime Minister. But Yeltsin never got off the plane. They waited for hours. Finally, an announcement came. The president is unwell. The truth, however, was that Yeltsin was too drunk to stand. A similar incident occurred in Oslo in 1996. During a meeting with the King of Norway, Yeltsin was so intoxicated that his aides had to hold him upright. Photos were taken but never published. News agencies were ordered to bury the images. And now, the question you should ask is this. If the leader of a country was in such an uncontrollable state, how safe were that country's nuclear codes? Because Russia still possessed the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And Yeltsin, in theory, had the authority to use those weapons. Could the man who stumbled before the White House one night have started a nuclear war? America's intelligence agencies asked that question, and the answer kept them awake at night. Some reports inside the Kremlin showed that Yeltsin would sometimes disappear for days, not answer phone calls, and completely detach himself from state affairs. In 1996, after suffering a heart attack, he spent months in the hospital, but official statements always referred to a temporary illness. The truth was that Russia was being governed by a ghost. The oligarchs had grown stronger. Power struggles within the Kremlin had intensified, and Yeltsin was increasingly becoming a figurehead. Yet he still refused to step down. Perhaps he couldn't, because if he left, he didn't know what would happen to him. Politics in Russia was a ruthless game, and losers rarely met a good end. But perhaps the most striking part of this story was not Yeltsin's weakness. It was how the system around him tried to keep that weakness invisible. Because every scandal, every embarrassing moment, every drunken fall was carefully covered up by state media and foreign diplomats alike. In 1997, at a press conference with U.S. President Bill Clinton, Yeltsin burst out laughing uncontrollably. The two presidents were trying to answer serious questions about NATO expansion, but Yeltsin could barely stand. Clinton, visibly uncomfortable, kept smiling to maintain the atmosphere. Later, journalists would joke about it as two happy presidents, but the truth was that it was another diplomatic embarrassment quietly erased from the archives. Meanwhile, in Russia, the people were losing faith. Pensioners were not being paid. Soldiers returning from the Chechen front were broken. The dream of democracy was turning into a nightmare. And Yeltsin, increasingly isolated, began to trust no one. He replaced ministers one after another. The government changed almost every few months. Moscow became a battleground of businessmen intelligence officers, and politicians fighting for influence. And in the middle of it all, Yeltsin tried to hold on, both to power and to life itself. The end came slowly. In 1999, after another wave of health problems and growing public outrage, Yeltsin announced his resignation. It was New Year's Eve. His voice trembled as he said, "I have done everything I could. I ask for your forgiveness for not meeting some expectations." Then, he handed over power to a relatively unknown figure, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. At that moment, no one knew that this quiet former KGB officer would reshape Russian history for decades to come. Yeltsin spent his remaining years away from politics, mostly in silence. He rarely appeared in public, occasionally attending official ceremonies, but his health continued to decline. In 2007, he died of heart failure. His funeral was attended by world leaders, but few spoke openly about his troubled legacy. Some remembered him as the man who brought democracy to Russia. Others, as the leader who let the country fall apart under the influence of alcohol and chaos. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. It was not just the story of a drunken president. It was the story of a world trying to find balance after the Cold War, of leaders caught between old systems and new realities. Yeltsin was a man of contradictions, brave yet reckless, visionary yet self-destructive. He wanted to bring freedom to his people, but he couldn't free himself from his own demons. Years later, when Bill Clinton was asked about that night, he smiled and avoided the question. Boris was a unique man, he said diplomatically. But those who were there remember the truth. They remember the barefoot Russian president, stumbling under the dim lights of Pennsylvania Avenue, muttering about pizza and laughter, unaware that he had just created one of the strangest and most human moments in political history. And perhaps that's why Yeltsin's story still fascinates us today. Because behind the speeches, the nuclear buttons, and the official titles, there was a man, flawed, emotional, impulsive, and tragically real. The man who danced on stage, who fell off planes, who fought communism with one hand and his own vices with the other. The man who, in one unforgettable night, reminded the world that even those who rule nations are still painfully, beautifully human.